Lost World of the Human Hybrids is the name of the lecture. You'll see why. My book, Göbekli Tepe, which came out earlier this year, suggested that the comet impact, which science now knows took place around 10,900 BC, created a global ash cloud due to wildfires, which went up into the atmosphere and blotted out the sun, causing a nuclear winter for an extended period of time. This and other things triggered a 1300-year mini ice age known as the Younger Dryas. And basically, it would appear that this caused both the cataclysm itself and the actual re-advance of the ice sheets caused a number of different cultures and populations around the world to migrate into new territories, most obviously going towards the south, because this wasn't just a period of, the temperature drop by at least 10 degrees, but on top of this was the fact that there were severe droughts because the ice takes up all the water and causes, massive famines and droughts. So you can imagine all these people, being displaced into, neighbouring territories, coming across the inhabitants of these territories, perhaps bashing them on the head or trying to take over and whatever. Well, amongst these people in Central and Eastern Europe were a population known as the Swede Aryans, after a place called Swede in Poland. Now, their territory stretched all the way from the Carpathian Mountains in the west right away across to some of the large rivers in central Russia. And as I show in Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods, there is good evidence to suggest that the Swede Aryans migrated south and entered into the area of the Caucasus, and from the Caucasus went through the Armenian highlands into the area of southeast Anatolia, where Göbekli Tepe was constructed around 11,500 years ago. Now, the Swede Aryans, this is the image that was done for the book by the London artist Russell Hussain, who's not with us today but will be on the walk tomorrow. The Swede Aryans were reindeer hunters, they were wolf shaman, they were long-distance traders in exotic flint and obsidian. They're also some of the earliest open-cast miners in the world. Plus, they were stone tool specialists with a sophisticated stone-making technology. And amongst the technologies they introduced into the area of southeast Anatolia was something known as advanced pressure flaking. Now, I'm not going to go into what that is, but it makes flints look very, very beautiful, as you can see of these obsidian points here, which actually come from central Anatolia. And it would seem as if they introduced these ideas into the area of Anatolia from Russia and the Ukraine. Now, the incoming Swede Aryans would seem to have entered the communities not only as traders, but also as virtual messianic figures. And the reason for this is that it would appear that even 1,000 years after the cataclysm, there were still other events going on. Bad things were going on in the world, and there was this constant fear of further cataclysm every time comets appeared in the sky. And it's my belief from the evidence that I've discovered is that they possibly came up with the remedy of how to counteract the supernatural forces that were responsible for these cataclysms, which they saw in terms of a supernatural wolf or fox. And that one of the solutions was the supersizing of cult buildings and the creation of complexes like Göbekli Tepe, of which I think Göbekli Tepe is probably only one of various examples around the world which are now being realised for their great antiquity. Moreover, there is evidence that the Swede Aryans were Neanderthal human hybrids. And this comes from anatomical evidence that's been associated with their culture, which shows that they were extremely long-headed individuals, with strong brow ridges, large jaws, and other so-called archaic human features. And the first person to connect them with this was the famous Lithuanian archaeologist and prehistorian Marija Gumbatus, who was a very, very, very clever woman and written various books, as many of you will probably know. Now, the difference between ourselves and our distant cousins, the Neanderthals, is most obviously seen in the skulls, because our Homo sapien ancestors had skulls that were actually a lot thinner, longer. The Neanderthal skulls were much wider, but the important thing is that the Neanderthals had much longer skulls. They had what's known as an occipital bun here, which you can see here, okay? And it would seem as if the hybrids inherited this, as we'll see. And this is very, very important. I mean, this is a skull from a place called the Shanidar Cave in Upper Iraq. And it dates about 60,000 years old. It's Neanderthal. And you can see just how extended this skull actually is. And there's a significance here in this particular skull because in 1982, an anthropologist by the name of Trinkus actually wrote a thesis suggesting that these skulls that were found in the Shanidar Cave, of which there was more of them, actually were artificially deformed. In other words, this was deliberate skull elongation. And yet, years later, he and other writers retracted this and said, no, we got it wrong. These are actually natural skulls. And this is really, really interesting when you come on to the whole idea of whether elongated skulls are natural or not. Here's another skull from a place called Amud in Upper Galilee in Israel, which is 60,000 years old. You can see the occipital bun there, how wide it is, against our own ancestors, which is Cro-Magnon man in Europe, is 28,000 years old. And you can see how rounded that is. And look at the forehead. The forehead goes straight up. The forehead on the Neanderthals sweeps back. And you can see these incredible brow ridges. These same brow ridges are found on the anatomical evidence relating to the Swede Aryans. We don't have that. I mean, obviously there's still people alive today that have these brow ridges, and there is a strong possibility and a strong case to suggest that, they have a bit more Neanderthal in them than other people. Now, it would appear that the Swede Aryans themselves had long heads, and that their descendants in southeast Anatolia and in northern Syria, in northern Iraq, remembered these ancestors themselves and actually saw themselves as their descendants, that they formed their own elites and continued the traditions, and that they deliberately deformed their heads to look like the ancestors. In other words, they themselves now, although they actually had long heads, they were accentuating the size of it by deliberately deforming them, almost, caricaturizing their own belief in what the ancestors had. And this is a particular skull that dates about 5,500 to 4,500 from the Halif culture, who was definitely one of the direct descendants of the Göbekli builders. And eventually this idea of skull elongation was portrayed in statues, and these are the most obvious examples. Many of you will have seen these in my books and others. The culture that followed the Halif was the Ubaid, and these particular statues, which are both male and female and appear to have a serpent or lizard-like head, were found in many, many graves and have been associated by prehistorians with the skull elongation of the Halif and the Ubaid people. So in other words, basically what this actually shows is some kind of abstract form of an elite who had existed with an elongated head.